Did you say your theme parks?
Yes, our theme parks have been reopened in Hong Kong.
Man, fuck you.
Welcome to episode 3 of Quarantine Conversations. I'm Sean, and today we're going to have an interview with a good friend of mine who also goes to King's. He studies history, and we're going to learn more about, from him, the coronavirus situation in India. Hope you enjoy. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Krish. Do you want to kind of talk about yourself and what you do and where you are at the moment?
Sure. So as you know, my name is Krish. So I was born and brought up in India. I'm now in my second, almost in my third year of my history undergrad at King's College in London. So I am in pretty much rural setting in India, which is about 3 hours by car or maybe half an hour by boat from the city of Bombay. I'm staying there obviously in lockdown during this entire coronavirus situation, and I haven't left in about, I think, 3.5 months now from the time that I came back from London. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, no, so most of the Western world will be concentrated on the severity of what we can see in America, and of course what we see in Europe, and I think what we see in Southeast Asia, and of course we can see the examples of Hong Kong and Taiwan and New Zealand showing that most of the, I think, recovery is there, and now they're reopening the economy. What I want to start off with is, how do you see the situation in India? Do you see it's improving? And how long do you think will you sort of get out of lockdown? How long more will you think you stay in lockdown?
Well, the situation is not really improving. It's definitely going to get worse. That's primarily because obviously we have a humongous population, one that has like an extreme reliance on, say, like daily wages or being just like in really close contact with other people living in urban centers. So that, I mean, like the spread has just become exponential. And in terms of when I think the lockdown will be lifted, so I think about 3 days ago was the first relaxation of the lockdown. But that was done when our infections hadn't yet reached their peak. So the only reason that they lifted the lockdown was for economic purposes, which was made quite clear by the government that they don't have much of a choice anymore. So while legally there's no lockdown or there's no curfew like there was, most people who don't have a reliance on, say, on like daily wages, as I said earlier, those people will most probably remain in lockdown until maybe the infections are less rampant. So I don't see the situation really improving anytime soon. But I guess that's the situation, most countries like India would be in.
I see.
Yeah.
So I think I would like to remind people, of course, what Krish was talking about is on the 8th of June, I think the government has allowed people to reopen shopping malls, places of worship, restaurants and offices. But of course, there's this very strict guidance on staggered work times, and especially for temples, there's no edible offerings, which is, I think, a huge potential of contact between people. I want to move on to maybe the situation, especially in your state. So in your state, Maharashtra, that's where the city Mumbai is, which is where most of the infections are taking place. Can you tell me maybe what the situation is like there specifically?
While I am living outside the city, I am in very, very close contact with the city. Since we're in like a rural area, we do rely very heavily on the city naturally. So right now, Bombay has the highest number of recorded cases in all of India. That could, I mean, obviously, the statistics aren't reliable. I mean, like official figures posted at about 55,000 right now. Indian statistics genuinely are extremely unreliable, mostly because we don't have the infrastructure to monitor every single case. We don't have the infrastructure for people to actually come in and and well, just like get basic medical attention. And I think that's the situation a lot of countries are facing, not just India, obviously. While I say that Bombay might have the most cases at about 55,000, the number may just be a whole lot more, and I might be completely unaware about it. Of course, both of us can only speculate. We have no idea what the actual statistics are. But one thing that I would maybe want to highlight would be the lack of medical infrastructure, especially when it comes to protecting the hospital staff, which is again, quite an international problem. So most of the doctors don't actually have PPE suits. So my uncle is actually one of the head doctors at the city's leading hospital. He was sort of saying last week he had almost 8 of the staff under him, nurses. They were all admitted in a span of about 5 hours. They were all diagnosed with COVID-19. So the level of medical attention that one can get in this country is not at the highest level. I mean, it can be a bit scary for a citizen like me who would possibly be affected by it. It's not the ideal situation.
Do you feel as though that the lockdown you had for 3 months, not you personally, but as a whole maybe country, or maybe just your state specifically,
yeah,
is that lockdown really a lockdown? Because I know for India, as a country which doesn't have the infrastructure like a lot of Western European countries, people have to go into work to buy food, to earn their salary, and these are the main preoccupations of many people. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely not a lockdown. I mean, I think almost a month ago now, they reopened liquor shops for about 3 or 4 days, and I was literally sent videos by a few of my friends showing lines that were stretching over a kilometer, all lined up outside the liquor stores. There was no social distancing, and liquor prices had soared through the roof, so there was a whole sort of scandal. What one might just consider a fairly daft reason. It's just because people didn't have the basic sensibility to maybe socially distance for something like liquor. That causes a lot of issues. Obviously, when it comes to basic necessities, that was also really, really hard to get around. So people were definitely moving around like in other countries, just to get groceries and stuff like that. But in that sphere, there was fairly decent measures put into place where people were definitely made to stand 6 feet apart, and we did have police checkpoints where people would be asked to justify why they're leaving their house. So it wasn't a complete Wild West. It was there was some order in it for sure. The people flouting lockdown rules is ridiculous. There was a religious festival that was held in Delhi.
Yeah.
I think in the month of April. They had a gathering of over 1,000 people. Those 1,000 people moved all over India and which literally created over 400 super spreaders. And they claimed that it was all fine because it was done for religious purposes. So they literally, when the government tried tracking them down, they started hiding because people were calling for their blood and shit.
I want to maybe turn back our attention to infrastructure of India, because I think people would be interested to know these contexts. You've already mentioned food just now, but also let's say the infrastructure of Wi-Fi, of course, maybe communications, telecom networks, but also something like transportation in your country. Do these things have, I think, an effect on making it harder for the government to solve this corona crisis?
Definitely. To start with, when you're looking at stuff like Wi-Fi, when you're looking at stuff like telecoms, I personally had to face that last week when we were hit by one of the first tropical cyclones that have hit us in a while, actually. So that knocked out my electricity, that knocked out my cellular, and that knocked out my Wi-Fi for about a week. Still a bit patchy. That was a new experience for me. Not so new for like a lot of the people living in the villages close by. So definitely commendable the way that they live, and really eye-opening for me. That obviously makes it harder because then you have hospitals without electricity. You can't really communicate with people because you don't have cell phones. So I mean, it's really, really difficult, especially considering that about 60% of our population lives in rural areas, right? So if you don't have that kind of basic infrastructure, it's really difficult. Having said that, obviously, what I would say in the last 5 years, that infrastructure has been improved. I mean, the government's not just sitting back; they are taking steps toward it, but it's nowhere close to most of the countries in the West. So that definitely makes it harder because they don't get news, false information can't really be censored, can't really be controlled, and basic repairs, medical attention, it's really difficult for it to be provided. The second part, which is transport. So that was one of the biggest things. So the entire migrant crisis, which sort of hit India and was, really in the news in the first few weeks of the lockdown. So just to give you like a really, really quick overview of that, there are a lot of daily wage workers who move around sort of interstate, and they were left trapped by the lockdown because all forms of transport were shut. So you had thousands of people moving in groups, again, zero social distancing, moving in groups, walking, hiring trucks, just trying to get back home. There was no way to actually get across to these people and, sort of explain to them the risk that they were putting themselves at. And it was quite a sad situation because you have these people who are basically homeless because they're displaced daily wage workers. In fact, there was quite a moving story which most of the international community, I guess, would have heard of, which was the 15-year-old girl who cycled her father home, literally across 2 states. Obviously, it makes it really hard for the government to deal with it because you don't have enough transport. They were charging these migrant workers 5,000 rupees for one train ticket. So just to put that in perspective, 5,000 rupees is about 50 pounds. And the sort of poverty line of Bombay is 28 rupees, which is 0.2 pounds.
Yes.
So just to sort of put that in perspective, it's an absolutely insane number to be charging daily wage workers.
Is the train privatized or nationalized?
That is nationalized.
Okay.
However, the question that really would arise to someone like me, the fact that it's nationalized and they were still charging that much was quite disturbing because we have no idea why they needed to charge that much for these special trains. States obviously offered to pay for their people's train tickets, but there was a bit of political, haggling about the state budgets and who would foot the bill.
I just maybe want you to talk a bit more about, because I think people would like to know, is what the government has done actually to improve the accuracy of reported deaths, because the figures the government has doesn't reflect actually the real picture, the gravity of the situation in India.
So honestly, if you ask my personal opinion, I don't think that the government has done much to improve these statistics, especially when it comes to active cases. What I have heard is that doctors are being actively discouraged from prescribing COVID-19 tests. So my sister, well, she's not staying with us, so she was recently in contact with someone who was later tested positive for COVID-19. But it's proving exceptionally difficult for us to get her to have a COVID-19 test because none of the doctors seem to want to prescribe it. And that's primarily because of police action. You know how these doctors give out permission to be tested. So obviously they can't record the true number of active cases. Not to mention the cases that no one would be aware of because they're in rural areas or in places where the government doesn't have reach. When it comes to deaths, I haven't really had any experience with the hotline, obviously. But I mean, I personally don't believe that that's going to make much of a difference, because if the number of cases is supposed to be a lot higher, then so are the number of deaths. So I'm not, but that sort of correlation leads me to believe that there's not much of an effort.
What do you see in the near future of India? Because, as you've said in the beginning, that the government recently has relaxed the rules to actually kickstart some parts of the economy, and we know that they have reopened some filming for soap operas. Yeah, I was wondering, do they have a certain safeguard that if the situation actually gets worse, which it is at the moment, they'll suddenly stop the economy again, or just let the economy run at a very limited state, like what it is at the moment, and see how people persevere through it?
Well, the entire situation that we've sort of painted of India through the podcast, people don't really have a choice. I mean, like, I'm sort of privileged enough to have a choice to care about the disease, but a lot of people don't. I mean, if they get it, they get it. They sort of have to learn to live with it. Obviously, our government hasn't laid out a plan because they're taking it literally as the day comes, almost as every other Indian citizen is. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because I don't know if they have the capability to do anything else. I mean, I think they have to open up the economy. They can't slow it down because they're risking too many people's livelihoods. It's just a sad fact that we have to live with. Sure, there's a disease, but we just have to move past it, basically. Again, I'm seeing this in a fairly comfortable situation. Like, all I can do is sort of sympathize with the people who have to live with it. So the government actually, if you look at the way that they initiated the lockdown, they didn't really tell us that, look, we're going to have a lockdown for the next 3 months. They started with one day, they moved that on to 1 week, then they moved it on to a month, and then a further month. So honestly, you and I know just as much about what India is going to do as the next person.
How do you rate the government's performance then? I mean, coming from, I think, a decent, well-off middle-class family in India, do you feel as though they are doing actually their very best as a government?
From what I can see, and from the news that I watch, nobody's really discontent with the government. Nobody's really paying attention to the government response. I mean, the majority of the population, which I can't really call myself, they're not really looking at the government response right now. They're more concerned about their individual livelihoods. And I can't really blame them for that, because, I mean, like, they're literally living, like, from paycheck to paycheck. So there's not much else that they're concerned about other than themselves and their family. How I would personally rate the government's response, it's a bit of a tricky question. Generally, I'm a bit of a pessimist, and I would say that they handle it in a really, really terrible way. But given the scale of our country, I can't really blame them that much, because they don't have much at their disposal, which, if you think about it, is the fault of our past governments, etc., etc. But I would say like an average rating, maybe about 5 out of 10, because sure, they've tried to follow international standards, but they've screwed up and they've not seen huge crises like the migrant worker crisis. That actually they should have foreseen, quite frankly, because if you lock the borders, they should know that there are millions of migrant workers spread through the country which are going to need to come back. So rather than focusing on that, the government focused on sending rescue flights to international migrant workers. That didn't matter as much as the ones displaced within our own country. I mean, like, the scale of this is pretty much unprecedented. So I can't blame this government for something that no government in the world really can handle that well, you know? There's always entertaining stuff in Indian politics. But my hands are a bit less because Parliament's not really open. So one of the state ministers, I'm not going to take his name, he decided one day that he wants to take a vacation. So he literally took his chopper in the middle of the crisis and jetted off to his vacation home in the middle of this crisis.
Yes.
And nobody knows about it. Nobody's talking about it.
And his vacation home is in India.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's your Dominic Cummings story right there.
Yeah.